This is a History of Western Thought number 9 on Socrates. As we've completed our look at the pre-Socratic era, we now get to the era of the three most important philosophers of ancient Greece, them being Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And of those three, we begin with Socrates. Now, Socrates is a figure that is a lot different from Plato and Aristotle in one particularly important way, and that is that Socrates himself never wrote anything, at least not anything that survives today. So in order to understand Socrates' life and thought, we really have to look at sources outside of himself and look at contemporaries and those who knew Socrates, who explained his thought as well as the different actions in his life. And as we do that, we see that they had very different interpretations of Socrates. And so we are going to look at various sources and how they understand Socrates, as well as his impact on the development of philosophy. But before we do that, we'll just do a quick overview of who Socrates was and of his life. Socrates was born around the year 470, though we're not sure exactly which year it was. There's some debate and disagreement about that. And his father was a sculptor. So Socrates himself took up his father's profession at first as a sculptor. Now, Socrates was known in his younger life for traveling around to see the other merchants and engage in dialogue and discussion. He was clearly interested in ideas and in speaking to others about ideas and getting others' thoughts about various things. Socrates also did serve in the military for a time, but he's most well known for his activities as a philosopher in the city of Athens. And so, like the sophists, Socrates spent much time going around the city of Athens and teaching his various philosophical ideas, but he often did it through dialogue, questioning others, and trying to come to specific definitions of terms that people commonly used. Now, unlike the sophists, Socrates did not charge for his services. So there does appear to be in Socrates a desire for wisdom and understanding that goes beyond just monetary gain. So this differentiates him from the sophists, though some in his era did see him as basically just another sophist, one who just happened not to ask for money like the others did. But that's most of Socrates' life as far as we know, though there are many tales and stories about things that he did, but it's hard to say which of those things are actually real or not. But perhaps what he's most well known for in his life is the trial and death of Socrates, where he becomes a kind of martyr for philosophy. So there is some debate and doubt as to exactly what the cause of Socrates' execution by the state was. But the official charges that he was charged on were, one, corrupting the minds of the young, and the other was of impiety, or arguing against the gods. And under these charges, he was forced to drink hemlock, a kind of poison, and he did die. So there's discussion and debate as to exactly what the cause or the reason for this is. And likely, a lot of it has to do with the fact that he was indeed critical of the state of Athens in various ways. He fought against the kind of might makes right mentality that many had. Instead, he was desirous for a real search for what is the good, for what is just, and argued that people should be looking for actual goodness and justice, and that those things should rule what's going on in the state. And because of that, he was critical of things that were going on. Now, we don't know exactly the details of this because the accounts differ. But we do know that he was critical of the state, and that did end with an execution, which, as I said, does make Socrates a kind of martyr of philosophy. In the tales of Socrates and his death become embellished much throughout time. But not all portrayals of Socrates are necessarily positive. In fact, the earliest portrayal we have of Socrates is not positive at all. He shows up as a character in Aristophanes, who was an early playwright, particularly of comedies, in his play called The Clouds, where Socrates literally comes down with his head in the clouds, which just gives you a kind of idea of his view of Socrates. So according to Aristophanes, Socrates was basically just a troublemaker within the city of Athens, And he sees him really as not much different from the other sophists. The only thing that differentiated him was the fact that he didn't charge for his services, but otherwise he was just there to kind of make trouble and question all sorts of things that need not be questioned. So not everyone liked Socrates. It's very clear that there are some who were quite critical of what he was doing. But the sources that we tend to rely on the most for Socrates are from two of his students, and these, of course, are going to be more positive than we get in other authors, and that is Plato and Xenophon, though there are others that mention Socrates as well. Now, Plato's portrayal of Socrates is the one that often gets the most attention, and this is, of course, the Socrates that has the most influence on the history of philosophy, only because of the influence that Plato himself has. But the problem is Socrates is really just a character in Plato's dialogues. And while we know that Plato was a student of Socrates, it's basically impossible to figure out which aspects of the Socrates as a character are just that of the character that Plato has created, and which things actually come from Socrates himself. So it's likely that we really will never be able to figure out exactly what corresponds to the real Socrates and what ideas just come from Plato's Socrates. So there are some differences between Xenophon and Plato's version of Socrates. Particularly, the character of Socrates comes across as different in that in Xenophon, he comes across as very arrogant, very sure of himself. And Plato's version of Socrates is one who was always questioning himself and questioning his own wisdom in his own search for wisdom. So we have the humble Socrates that shows up in Plato, but then we have the arrogant Socrates that shows up in Xenophon. Now, Xenophon doesn't see Socrates in a negative light. He was a student of Socrates and admired him very much, but we do see that there are different accounts of his character. So who is Socrates in the way that we know him in modern philosophy today? And that's really the question that we have to ask. And the Socrates that really influences the way that we do and engage in the discipline of philosophy is the one that comes from Plato. So what are some of Socrates' major ideas and themes that develop throughout the history of philosophy? So the first aspect of Socrates that we have to understand is the Socratic method. Socratic dialogue. This is often what his name is associated with. And this is likely something that Socrates actually did, because this does show up in Plato and Xenophon's works, though they do approach those things slightly differently. And so the way that Socrates is used in these pieces of literature, which are the dialogues of Plato, they're basically set up as a series of dialogues between Socrates and other individuals. Now, not all of the dialogues center around Socrates. They have various other individuals in them as well. But essentially, we have Socrates as a character who is in search of wisdom. And wisdom for Socrates begins with the fact that he himself does not know anything. So for Socrates, the one who is truly wise is the one that they admits that they have no wisdom. As soon as someone says that they have wisdom, they feel like they have approached something that they indeed have not. So the first step to gaining wisdom is admitting that you don't know, and that admission of your lack of knowledge is then what leads to you actually in a search for knowledge. So probably the most famous phrase, other than Socrates saying that he knows nothing and that the truly wise knows nothing, is he says that the unexamined life is not worth living. So Socrates is in a search for wisdom, for an examination of some of the basic ideas of life that Socrates himself felt people simply didn't stand back and think about. They simply lived life without any real examination of why they did the things they did, why they said the words they did, why they did the actions that they did. And so throughout these dialogues, Socrates is very often just in the marketplace talking to regular people. And so he sets himself up as just a kind of regular person asking a lot of questions. And he walks around to various characters or individuals within the marketplace and then asks them about certain things like justice, for example. Just one example of the kind of questions that he has. And then he asks a series of questions to get across their own ideas of that subject. And by his own questions, he often demonstrates to people that they really don't know what they even mean by some of the basic ideas in terms that they use. Now, if you read these dialogues and think of them as something that really happened, you probably would get rather annoyed with the character of Socrates. You're trying to work in the marketplace and just sell things, and some guy comes along and just asks you a bunch of obscure questions. So Socrates doesn't always come across as that likable of a character. But he is asking a lot of very important questions that need to be raised and that really still deserve to be raised today. So what are some of the particular ideas that Socrates emphasizes then that become popular, not just his method, but his ideas? So Socrates himself is not concerned so much with the area of metaphysics or basic truths of the universe. He does not deal extensively with things like universals or the nature of God or the gods, at least not in Plato's dialogues until his later dialogues. Now, Plato does say that he gets his idea of the forms, which we will discuss in the next video. He says he gets that from Socrates, but most people believe that he's really not taking that from Socrates himself, though Socrates has some ideas that may lend themselves to this concept of universals. And the way that Aristotle sees this, for example, is that Socrates looked for universal definitions of things, specifically things like goodness, virtue, justice. He wanted to find concrete universal definitions of various terms that were important, especially for the moral life. Now, from those universal uses of terms, Plato then goes to formulate his notion of the forms. But that really doesn't show up in Socrates, at least according to most early sources other than Plato himself. But Socrates is more concerned about two other questions rather than metaphysics, and that is ethics primarily, and secondarily that of epistemology, or the idea of knowledge. Now, he doesn't get into questions of epistemology that arise later in terms of our knowledge of the external world, and is that possible, and how is that possible, the kind of questions that we do raise in the modern era. But instead, he's concerned with how to gain moral knowledge, how to gain knowledge of virtue, how to gain knowledge of what is good, or of man's happiness. Now, the term happiness is going to show up throughout ancient philosophy as we continue this study. But what happiness means is not what we think of today. Happiness does not just mean, what gives me momentary pleasure. We think of happy today, we think of one who is feeling some kind of sense of elation at the moment. But happiness instead is to be seen as more the overall well-ordered life for the good of man. And so it's something much more comprehensive than just a fleeting emotion or feeling as we often think of in terms of happiness today. So for Socrates, the good of man is to be acted out by acts of virtue or of goodness. Now, Socrates believes that the passions must be controlled. Some people are simply controlled by passions. They just do whatever they feel is right at the moment. They may gorge themselves on food and be overindulgent. But while that might give temporary or momentary pleasure, that is not going to bring happiness in the overall sense of the term. It's not going to be for man's overall good. Now, Socrates argues that the way to solve this dilemma or to promote virtue within people is to teach, for people to learn. And so he believed that virtue and knowledge are very much connected. In some sense, you could say that virtue and knowledge even are one and the same thing. And so if goodness, knowledge, virtue, if all of these things are connected, the way that one comes to live a virtuous life is through the gaining of knowledge. And so a large part of the problem in terms of people not living a virtuous life is simply they are not educated about what the good is, about what happiness is. And as people learn more, they are then educated and can develop virtue in light of that. So one may, for example, think that happiness is gorging oneself on as much food as possible, because in the moment they're getting a lot of pleasure out of it. But that individual might not realize that this is really not for their good if they look in the long term and the effects that'll have on their body and on their health and just their inability to do other things because they're wasting their time just gorging themselves. And so it's through a process of gaining further knowledge that one's life then would change, and they would understand that gorging oneself with food is not necessarily a good thing. Now, there are some debates and discussions about Socrates in terms of his asceticism and the questions of whether Socrates was a complete ascetic, essentially saying you deny yourself all passions and desires. It doesn't appear that that's the case, though some pictures of Socrates may be influenced by early Christian monasticism. Picture him as. He doesn't seem in other places to just reject those things altogether, but instead he argues that they must be well ordered and one must not be simply guided by pure desire. Instead, one must rationally come to various conclusions about things and one can then use acts of pleasure insofar as one sees fit. So what we do see in Socrates, which does lead us to the time of Plato and then later Aristotle, is that he is looking for universal principles. Now, he is doing this in terms of ethics more than anything else. He does believe that there is a real standard of what is good, and he is in a search to find out exactly what the good for man is. And that does lead him to universal definitions of various ideas like justice, virtue, and goodness. And this is going to be developed later. And so these are just some of the basic ideas that we find in Socrates. I know this video is a little bit longer than some of the other ones. There's so much we could talk about in terms of Socrates and his picture in Plato. But here is a brief overview of him as a figure and his importance in philosophy. In the next video, we are going to begin looking at the life and ideas of Plato. Thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you are interested in this and further content. We'll see you next time.